I identify as a community builder.
Okay.
And I recently, well, not even recently now, it feels recently, but within the past year, I read Brad Feld's Startup Communities, and I really enjoyed it. And so, question is, so if entrepreneurs are the leaders in a startup ecosystem, and Brad talked about this, how do we help the quote unquote feeders come to accept the role, where it's like they're not necessarily taking the charge, they're allowing the entrepreneurs to take the charge.
Let me ask you, who do you consider the feeders? Because people have different definitions of that. So let's make sure we got the right definition. What's your definition of a feeder?
So any organization that provides value to entrepreneurs.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. If you look at how most startup communities start, they really start from one or two sort of groups. They either start because there's a whole bunch of entrepreneurs who just don't ask permission and just build stuff. Mm-hmm. And then there's other places where you've got these feeders or these organizations which help establish the ecosystem. I think in Detroit, you can argue that it might be one of those two. If you look in the Bay Area, for instance, those were entrepreneurs. If you look in Boston, those were entrepreneurs. That was MIT. If you look in New York, you might argue there's a lot of feeders. There was a whole bunch of reasons why Boston for a long time was unfriendly to entrepreneurial activity, and the Bay Area ate its lunch. And I think Boston kind of learned its way, and New York decided, hey, wait a minute, we could be the East Coast thing here. And a lot of feeders kind of helped develop that ecosystem. I would argue in Boulder, for instance, it's been sort of a mix of feeders versus the entrepreneurs. The key is when you get to the end state, and the end state is a self-sustaining entrepreneurial ecosystem, as you said, the entrepreneurs have to own it. Mm-hmm. And so the entrepreneurs need to identify those feeders and those organizations that are going to work in the way that they want to work. If I'm harsh or if I'm critical of Detroit, you look at sort of the first genesis of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, at least this time around, probably started 8 to 10 years ago. And it felt like the feeders, while mostly well-intentioned, wanted to own the ecosystem. If we're going to do all this work, we're going to own the ecosystem. Yeah. And there was this paternalistic attitude. And at that time, the entrepreneurs hadn't developed a strong enough base to push back. And so there was a whole bunch of rockiness and clunkiness and weird stories of, when I would come back here, I'd be like, what? I feel like that's turned now. I feel like you, the community builders, you, the entrepreneurs, now own Detroit. Mm-hmm. And by that I also mean Michigan and Ann Arbor and whatnot. Yeah. And it's and there's multiple feeders, right? Before there was one law firm, there was one person in investing in real estate, there was one this, there was two that. Now there's a whole bunch, right? There's WeWork, there's Bamboos, there's nobody's beholden to any one feeder. I think the feeder relative power has decreased. So now it's up to people like you to tell the feeders what we want, and if they don't want to play that game, then you find another feeder.
Yeah. And so you'd mentioned there, not just Detroit, but Michigan, Ann Arbor. So specifically for my podcast, but anything else I do, I try and look at things from even a Midwest perspective, but for now, like a statewide perspective, because I actually live in Ann Arbor. I go to Detroit all the time, Grand Rapids as well. And so, between the relationship with Denver and Boulder,
sure,
with that relationship, what insights do you think we can apply to the Ann Arbor and Detroit relationship?
So I think the interesting thing about Boulder and Denver is Denver's got, I think, 900,000 people. And that's just core city. When you figure the suburbs, it's 2 or 3 million. Boulder has 100,000 people. And when I moved to Boulder in 2006, 95% of the startup activity was in Boulder. And what's happened over time is has gone elsewhere. Boulder is still extremely vibrant. There's more startups than you could ever want. In fact, many people in Boulder say there's too many. I do not, but there are people who say that. What's happened though, there's been this movement to Denver. Cheaper housing, bigger space, people who move in and have spouses that work may have better opportunities economically in Denver because it's a bigger city. The beauty of the Boulder-Denver thing is there's no rivalry. And if I lived in the Bay Area for 10 years, and there were 3 locations. There was San Francisco, Palo Alto, and San Jose. And when I was there from 97 to 2006, it was Palo Alto had, sort of the arrogant view that we're what's now, and San Jose is the old folks, right? Those are the old entrepreneurs. And San Francisco had nothing. And now you fast forward to today, it moved up. The age of entrepreneurs went down as cost decreased. And when you think about the great democratization of entrepreneurism, is that you don't need to raise $5 million to start a company anymore. So younger people want to live in cities. They live in San Francisco. So now San Jose is like, I don't know what San Jose is, and Palo Alto is the old folks, and all the new hip people are in San Francisco. But there is a rivalry. It's not a tough rivalry. When I look at Michigan, I actually think it's more like Los Angeles or Southern California. There were these turf wars between downtown LA, Santa Monica. There was, there was a third location, I forget where, but they were vying to be the startup capital of Southern California. And I was like, guys, this is stupid. You're trying to divide up a pot of nothing. Yeah. Having 100% of zero is still zero.
True.
And interestingly, it's sort of fallen now to where Santa Monica is the hub, although there's some stuff in downtown. I've been very disappointed in the Ann Arbor-Detroit rivalry. Yeah. There is a clear rivalry. It has decreased over the years, but I'll tell you, I mean, the politics and the we're the startup hub. No, we're the startup hub. We're the startup hub. I believe that Ann Arbor and Detroit are close enough that you can sort of combine that, and that I'm a two-time Michigan grad. Spent a lot of time in Ann Arbor. Love the place to death, but there's some arrogance there, right? We're smarter. We're Michigan. Blah blah blah. But there's also some sense of entitlement there. Whereas Detroit, I find, has very little entitlement. These people just want to work, and I don't think Detroit or Ann Arbor should care. I think they should be helping each other, because especially for the state of Michigan, that's stupid, because there's just not enough of a pie to try to split it up.
What do you think it is about this sort of like disillusionment where core people know it's not a zero-sum game, but I mean the numbers speak for themselves, the perceptions speak for themselves. What do you think it is about that at least low-hanging fruit wise we can help to accomplish?
I think if I look at it this way, the government of Detroit cares very deeply about Detroit owning this. The government of Ann Arbor doesn't really care. The University of Michigan sort of cares. The university system down here sort of cares. And so what you're really looking at, the two biggest stakeholders that I see as an outsider who comes here a lot, is you've got the government and sort of the money in Detroit really wants to own it. And Ann Arbor sort of, I don't know, intellectual bureaucracy wants to own that. I think that people like you who clearly don't care about this rivalry and probably don't like it, I think the best way to break a rivalry is to go hug each other. It's Mo Wagner showing up at the end of the Houston game and giving that guy a hug. Don't as nasty as they are, just hug them back. Help them when they don't ask for it. Those are what are going to break down those walls. I do believe at the end of the day that the vast majority of entrepreneurial minded people I think they have good intentions. And as long as you guys hug each other and help each other and don't wait to be asked and just proactively help, I think that's going to smooth out over time. And frankly, it's smooth. I mean, look, I'm looking at the 10 years. It's smoothed out a lot, but there's still too much.
Yeah. So on that sort of note, you have a code of conduct, and it is, primarily a VC code of conduct.
Sure.
So there are some points that aren't necessarily like sharing each other's slide decks. Yeah, that's definitely a VC thing. But how do we sort of mass apply a code of conduct for how we should operate?
Well, I mean, I think it would be if I was going to write a code of conduct for an ecosystem, it would be very different than the code of conduct for VCs. I mean, it's no secret that I don't like the vast majority of VCs. I think 80%, 70% of VCs, I've had a bad week. I was going to say 90. Let's say 70% since it's being recorded. I just don't like. I don't think they're good people. I don't think their heart's in the right place. At the end of the day, I'm nothing but a highly paid middleman taking my investors' capital, investing in entrepreneurs. So why have this ego and I walk around like I'm God's gift? I don't know. But I digress. the code of conduct that I wrote was particular to VCs. This is how you should act. As far as an ecosystem, I think the Techstars sums it up the best. Give first. Mm-hmm. If your ecosystem has a give first mentality, that's probably the most important thing. Do no evil is probably second. Don't look for transactional relationships. So I don't know if you've ever studied. If you look at startup ecosystems that are thriving, what you notice is that they're not transactional relationships. I'm not doing this because I expect anything back from you. Mm-hmm. Why am I doing this with you today? Do you know why I'm doing this with you today?
No, just because you want to help.
Yeah, but I do have some expectation for you. I don't want anything back from you. But boy, it'd be really awesome one day if I hear, hey, you helped somebody else. You helped some other team. It's basically it's a centralized giving network, but it's not transactional one-to-one. And I think if I was going to have a code of conduct, it would be help with no expectation back. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't expect to get back something from the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. If I help, I should have a reasonable expectation that something good is going to come out of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily expect it back from you. And that's, to me, would be probably the third thing I would put in a code of conduct, because I think that's the most powerful thing.
Mm-hmm. So Steve Case has his Rise of the Rust initiative.
Yep.
He has a sort of thesis about the Rust Belt and the Rust Belt mentality, the startup ecosystems that are growing here. So what is your thesis with what is happening in the Midwest?
I wouldn't say that I have a thesis of what's happening in the Midwest. I have some opinions of what's happening in the Midwest. I think 2008 was a beautiful thing. I think the bankruptcy of the car industry was a beautiful thing for the entrepreneurial system. I grew up here. I spent the first 27 years of my life here, 25, 27, a lot of years. And I noticed that people who failed were called failures. And Midwest mentality was, if you failed, you were a failure. Mm-hmm. Entrepreneurs fail all the time. In fact, they fail 75% of the time. If we think that something that fails is a failure, that's not going to allow a culture to support entrepreneurs. When the car industry went dead, I noticed a remarkable change in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. That failure was now, whoa, this could happen to anybody. Mm-hmm. And the key is, do we get back up and keep fighting? Do we have resiliency? Resiliency was more honored than failure. And I think that what we're looking at is a time where the Midwest has, you've got these turn of events of manufacturing jobs decreasing, and certainly a lot of press about the coast and the wealth creation, but also the negatives of not wanting to live on a coast. We live in the Midwest for a reason. And now we have a culture that supports us here because we've seen that even the biggest can fail, and so it's okay. We can be resilient. So I think Steve and his folks are tapping on not only a massive culture shift that's happened since the recession, but also the fact that telecommunications and money and all that stuff's becoming fungible. People have decided they don't want to live in one of these startup hubs, but they still want to be part of that ecosystem, which is completely fine. And I think my partner Brad Feld's Startup Communities is evident of that. If you look at what we've done in Boulder, mm-hmm. which then spread to Denver, I think that's evident of that as well.
Yeah. So there's this sort of like Detroit versus everybody ethos. Yep. There's an Ann Arbor. Like, there are these silos, and me as a community builder, we run into things like that.
Right.
So what do you think it is about like the human mindset that is, what lends to a zero-sum mindset?
I think what lends to a zero-sum mindset is when there's not quite enough maturity or success in your ecosystem. And so everybody feels like they don't have enough. And I think it's just a matter of time. If you look at, big companies like Duo that are, when that thing sells or goes public, is radically going to change your ecosystem, because you're going to have, tens, if not 100 people with wealth that can do angel investing and break down these walls, right? And get these companies primed. We're on the precipice of that. You've got, firms like Ludlow, Trucks, Drive, that are here and on the ground all the time. You've got firms from Boulder, San Francisco, my buddies at True Ventures who did Duo, coming here. Once the mentality changes that we don't have to, that there's enough to go around and it's not a zero-sum game, then people will stop playing these stupid games and being siloed, right? In Boulder, everybody knows if we contribute to the ecosystem, we'll get way more back. I don't want to control any part of Boulder. In fact, every time I see a company get funded in Boulder that we didn't hear of, I'm like, excellent, this is great news.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't want to see every deal. I don't want to be, the firm in Colorado. I want to be an important firm in Colorado, and I want to be seen as good people. But once you graduate and, you need a 10, 20-year, outlook on this stuff, I feel like you guys are just on the precipice of having what's enough so that people stop saying, okay, I need to get my tiny little piece of the pie. There's just too much pie, and now you just go to work.
Yeah, for sure. And so let's say, for example, you have one wish, and the only thing is that genie that's granting that wish says it's for the Michigan startup ecosystem.
Yeah.
By Michigan, I mean the state, not the University of Michigan. So what would that wish be?
Am I allowed to ask for 10 more wishes?
No. It's like a genie rule. I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. I frankly, I'm not experienced in the genie wishes. I think the one wish that I would grant to Michigan would be to stop thinking about the externalities and just do it. Just break the rules, create the companies. Don't worry about it. Is there enough capital? Is there enough of that? Don't worry. Just go build the great companies. Everything else will follow.
And with that, I want to thank you for your time. This was great.
It was awesome. Thanks for having me.